The autumn sun was setting over Washington, D.C. as a black BMW rolled smoothly down the tree-lined streets of Georgetown. Behind the wheel sat a man in his mid-30s, dressed in a perfectly tailored Navy suit. To the outside world, he was just another successful real estate developer, the kind of person who turned old buildings into modern apartments and helped reshape the city's skyline. What no one knew, not even his closest friends, was that his real estate business was just a cover. In truth, he was one of the CIA's most effective deep-cover operatives, specializing in tracking domestic threats to national security. He'd spent the last 7 years building his cover identity, closing genuine property deals by day, while gathering intelligence on foreign agents by night. Today had been a good day. He'd just closed a $50 million deal to renovate an old warehouse district, a project that would both maintain his cover and create local jobs. His phone buzzed with congratulatory messages from other developers, none of whom suspected that their colleagues' real expertise lay in counterintelligence rather than property values. As he turned onto a quiet suburban street, red and blue lights suddenly flashed in his rearview mirror. He checked his speedometer. He'd been driving exactly at the limit. A quick mental check confirmed everything else was in order: license, registration, insurance, all up to date. Still, he pulled over smoothly, following years of training to remain calm in unexpected situations. 2 police officers approached his car, one on each side. The one on the driver's side had his hand resting on his holster, an unnecessarily aggressive stance for a routine traffic stop. The second officer shined his flashlight directly into the car, even though there was still plenty of daylight. License and registration, the first officer demanded, skipping any formal greeting. His nameplate read Officer Parker. The driver reached slowly for his documents, keeping his movements deliberate and visible. "May I ask why I'm being pulled over, officer?" Officer Parker ignored the question. He snatched the documents and studied them with exaggerated scrutiny while his partner continued shining the flashlight around the car's interior. The beam lingered on the leather briefcase in the passenger seat, the one containing classified documents about a suspected foreign intelligence network. "Step out of the vehicle," Parker ordered, his tone leaving no room for discussion. The driver knew his rights, but he also knew arguing would only escalate the situation. As a CIA operative, he'd been trained to read people, and everything about these officers' body language set off warning bells. This wasn't a routine traffic stop. They were looking for something, or more accurately, looking to create something. As he carefully opened his door, he activated the small recording device in his watch, standard CIA equipment for field operations. He couldn't blow his cover by identifying himself as an agent, but he could document whatever was about to happen. The setting sun cast long shadows across the street as he stepped onto the pavement, hands visible at all times. Behind the drawn curtains of nearby homes, lights were coming on as families gathered for dinner, unaware of the scene unfolding on their quiet street. The air was crisp with the promise of autumn, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and approaching rain. Little did these officers know, they weren't dealing with an ordinary citizen. Their target was a man who'd outwitted foreign intelligence agents, prevented terrorist attacks, and maintained deep cover in some of the world's most dangerous situations. But right now, none of that mattered. Right now, they only saw what they wanted to see, and that was about to lead them down a path they'd deeply regret. In the distance, thunder rumbled, as if nature itself was anticipating the storm about to break, not just in the weather, but in the lives of everyone involved in what was about to unfold. The tension in the air thickened as Officer Parker circled the black BMW, his boots crunching on fallen leaves. His partner, Officer Wilson, kept his flashlight trained on the driver, who stood calmly with his hands visible. The whole scene felt wrong, like a play where everyone knew their lines except the main character. "Got any weapons in the vehicle?" Parker asked, his voice carrying an edge that didn't match the routine nature of the question. "No, sir," the driver replied evenly. Years of CIA training had taught him to keep his voice steady, his face neutral. He'd stared down armed militants in war zones, but something about this situation felt more dangerous, perhaps because it was happening right here, on American soil, where it shouldn't be possible. Wilson moved closer, invading the driver's personal space. "You seem nervous," he said, though anyone watching would have seen that the driver was the calmest person present. "Not nervous, officer. just wondering why I was pulled over. The driver maintained eye contact, his voice respectful but firm. The recording device in his watch silently captured every word, every movement. Parker yanked open the passenger door without warning. Mind if we take a look around? It wasn't really a question. He was already leaning into the car, rifling through papers on the seat. I do mind, actually. I don't consent to a search. The driver's heart rate picked up slightly, not from fear, but from concern about the classified documents in his briefcase. If you don't have probable cause, I'd like to know why I was stopped. The officers exchanged a look that sent a chill down the driver's spine. He'd seen that look before in other countries, right before things went bad. Well, what do we have here? Parker emerged from the car holding a small plastic bag. The driver's blood ran cold. He knew with absolute certainty that bag hadn't been there moments ago. Looks like probable cause to me. The driver's mind raced through his options. He could reveal his CIA credentials, but that would compromise years of deep cover work and potentially national security. He could fight back legally, but that would mean letting this play out, letting himself be arrested for something he didn't do. That's not mine, he stated calmly, and I think we both know where it came from. The tiny red light on his watch confirmed it was still recording. Every word, every action, every abuse of power was being documented. Wilson grabbed the driver's arm roughly. You calling us liars? The threat in his voice was clear as summer lightning. I'm stating a fact, the driver replied, maintaining his composure even as cold metal handcuffs clicked around his wrists, and I'd like to speak to my lawyer. Rain began to fall, fat drops that seemed to sizzle on the cooling hood of the BMW. Neighbors had begun to peek through their curtains at the scene, their faces illuminated by the flashing police lights that painted the peaceful street in alternating red and blue. The driver could have broken free easily. His CIA training had taught him a dozen ways to escape handcuffs, but he remained still, letting himself be pushed into the back of the patrol car. Sometimes, he knew, the only way to fix a broken system was to let it break you first, to expose its flaws from the inside. Through the rain-streaked window, he watched Officer Parker continue to search his car, no doubt planting more evidence. The classified documents in his briefcase were encrypted and disguised as routine real estate paperwork, but still, every minute these corrupt officers spent pawing through his belongings put operations at risk. The patrol car's radio crackled with routine police chatter, a stark reminder of how ordinary this extraordinary situation appeared from the outside. To any passerby, it was just another arrest in the suburbs. They couldn't see the web of lies being woven, couldn't know that the calm man in the backseat had prevented terrorist attacks and protected national security countless times. As the patrol car pulled away, the driver caught a final glimpse of his BMW in the rearview mirror. The rain was falling harder now, washing away any evidence of tampering these officers might have left behind. But they had made one crucial mistake. They had chosen the wrong target. And soon, very soon, they would learn exactly how wrong they were. In the growing darkness, the driver allowed himself a small, grim smile. These officers thought they were ruining his life, but in reality, they were only ruining their own. The recording device in his watch continued its silent work, gathering evidence that would eventually tear their whole corrupt system apart. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in the police station's processing room, casting harsh shadows across worn linoleum floors. The driver sat quietly in a hard plastic chair, his expensive suit jacket now wrinkled from the rain and rough handling. Around him, the usual chaos of a busy station played out, phones ringing, officers shuffling papers, the occasional raised voice from the holding cells down the hall. He'd been here for 3 hours now, watching Officers Parker and Wilson build their case against him. Every so often, they'd disappear into a back room, emerging with another piece of evidence that hadn't existed before. The recording device in his watch captured it all, including their whispered conversations when they thought no one could hear. Your lawyer's on the way, a young desk officer informed him, barely looking up from his computer. Though I don't know why you'd need one if you're innocent. The driver didn't respond. He'd learned long ago that silence was often the best defense. Instead, he observed everything around him with the trained eye of a CIA operative. He noticed how Parker and Wilson kept disappearing into room 112. how they emerged with slightly dusty knees each time, suggesting they were accessing something under the desk or in a low cabinet. How they'd nod to certain officers but avoid others, indicating who was and wasn't part of their circle of trust. Through the window of an adjacent office, he could see them building their false narrative. They had a whiteboard covered with photos and sticky notes, constructing an elaborate story about a drug trafficking operation. His real estate business, they claimed, was just a front, ironically close to the truth, but for entirely different reasons. His thoughts turned to his handler at the CIA, who by now would have noticed his missed check-in. Standard protocol would have them tracking his watch's GPS signal to this location. Soon, they would begin their own quiet investigation, but they'd have to move carefully to protect his cover and ongoing operations. A new officer entered the room, carrying a stack of papers. "Quite a rap sheet we're building here," he said, dropping the files on a nearby desk. "Real estate developer turned drug kingpin. The press is going to love this one." The driver had to suppress a smile. These officers had no idea they were creating their own downfall with every falsified document, every planted piece of evidence. His watch was recording not just audio but also timestamps and GPS coordinates, making it impossible for certain pieces of evidence to have been found where they claimed. Through the station's windows, he could see news vans beginning to arrive. Parker and Wilson had called the media, obviously hoping to make a big show of their major drug bust. They had no idea they were actually documenting their own corruption for an audience of thousands. "Stand up," Parker ordered, returning with a camera. "Booking photo time." His smirk suggested he was enjoying this moment, watching a well-dressed professional reduced to a criminal booking photo. The driver stood calmly, facing the camera with dignity. In his mind, he was already calculating how this photo would look in court later, not as evidence against him, but as evidence of how far these officers were willing to go to frame an innocent man. More officers filtered into the room, drawn by the excitement of a big case. They didn't notice how their suspect observed each of their faces, memorizing names and badge numbers for future reference. They didn't realize that while they thought they were processing a criminal, they were actually providing evidence for a much larger federal investigation. The night wore on, and the station grew quieter. Most of the day shift had gone home, replaced by the skeleton crew of night officers. Through it all, the driver remained silent, watching Parker and Wilson dig themselves deeper with each falsified report, each planted piece of evidence. They had no idea that every document they created, every false statement they filed, was being tracked and logged. The timestamp on his watch's recording would prove it was impossible for them to have found drugs in his car during the initial stop. The GPS data would show how they'd moved his car to plant evidence. Their own security cameras would confirm their multiple trips to room 112 to gather their planted evidence. As midnight approached, the driver allowed himself a moment of reflection. In his years with the CIA, he'd seen corruption in many forms in many countries, but there was something particularly painful about seeing it here, in the very system meant to protect and serve. Still, he knew that sometimes the only way to fix a broken system was to let it break itself, and these officers were doing exactly that, one falsified document at a time. His lawyer would arrive soon, and this phase of the frame-up would end. But the real story was just beginning. Soon, these corrupt officers would learn the hard way that their perfect frame was about to become their perfect downfall. Miles away from the police station, in a secure office building overlooking the Potomac River, a team of CIA analysts was quietly going to work. The missed check-in from one of their top operatives had triggered a series of carefully planned protocols. On multiple computer screens, data from the operative's watch device streamed in real time, audio recordings, GPS coordinates, and timestamps that told a disturbing story of police corruption. The lead investigator, a veteran CIA handler with 20 years of experience, leaned back in her chair and studied the evidence mounting on her screens. She'd worked with the framed operative for 7 years, coordinating his deep cover operations while he built his real estate developer persona. Now she watched as local police unknowingly undermined years of careful intelligence work. "Pull up everything we have on Officers Parker and Wilson," she instructed her team. Within minutes, that histories filled the screens. Traffic stops, arrest records, civilian complaints. A pattern began to emerge, one that had been carefully hidden through strategic paperwork and buried reports. "Look at this," one analyst called out, pointing to his screen. 6 similar incidents in the past year alone, all involving successful professionals, all ending in dropped charges or quiet settlements. The pattern was clear. These officers had done this before, but never to someone equipped to fight back with such damning evidence. Down in the forensics lab, tech experts were already processing the audio from the watch device. Every conversation, every whispered plan between the corrupt officers was being enhanced and documented. The GPS data painted a clear picture of how they'd moved the operative's car to plant evidence, their movements contradicting the official police report they'd filed. Meanwhile, another team was carefully reviewing the classified materials in the operative's briefcase. They needed to know exactly what sensitive information might have been compromised when the officers searched the car. The documents appeared secure. The operative's cover as a real estate developer was holding, but the situation had created an unnecessary risk to national security. As morning approached, the investigation expanded. The handler authorized deep background checks on every officer in that precinct. Financial records, phone logs, and surveillance footage were collected and analyzed. A picture began to form of a systematic problem, not just 2 corrupt officers, but a network of misconduct that had gone unchecked for years. "We've got something," announced a junior analyst, breaking the focused silence. 3 years ago, an internal affairs investigation into Parker and Wilson was suddenly dropped. The investigating officer was transferred to a desk job in another district. He pulled up more records. And look at this. Their sergeant signed off on every questionable arrest, every suspicious evidence log. The handler nodded, adding another piece to the puzzle. This wasn't just about 2 officers planting evidence. This was about a system that protected its own, that punished those who tried to speak up, that buried complaints from citizens who had no way to prove their innocence. In another part of the building, a legal team was quietly preparing documents. They couldn't reveal their operative's true identity. That would compromise ongoing national security operations. But they could build a case that would expose the corrupt officers and their enablers using the evidence they'd unknowingly provided themselves. "Send a team to check the courthouse records," the handler instructed. "I want to know about every case these officers have been involved in for the past 5 years." She knew that once this case broke, others would come forward. Other victims would finally have a chance to be heard. As dawn broke over the city, the pieces were falling into place. The CIA team had built a wall of evidence that would be impossible to ignore. GPS data, time-stamped recordings, documented patterns of behavior, all pointing to a systemic abuse of power that was about to be exposed. The handler took a moment to review everything they'd gathered. In her years of intelligence work, she'd seen countless operations, but this one was different. This wasn't about international threats or foreign agents. This was about corruption in their own backyard, about abuse of power that affected ordinary citizens who didn't have the resources to fight back. Soon, very soon, Officers Parker and Wilson would walk into a courtroom thinking they had an easy conviction. Instead, they would walk into a trap of their own making, their years of misconduct exposed by the very evidence they thought would protect them. The handler allowed herself a small smile as she imagined their faces when they realized their perfect frame had backfired spectacularly. But for now, the investigation continued quietly, gathering strength like a wave building far out at sea, invisible from the shore, but growing more powerful by the minute. The corrupt officers had no idea what was coming, and that was exactly how the CIA team wanted it. The courthouse buzzed with activity on the first day of trial. Morning sunlight streamed through tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished marble floors. The accused sat quietly beside his public defender, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the nervous energy filling the courtroom. Officers Parker and Wilson sat at the prosecution table, looking confident in their pressed uniforms. They'd done this dozens of times before: arrest, plant evidence, testify, convict. It was almost routine for them now. The district attorney shuffled through his papers, ready to present what seemed like an airtight case. The judge, a veteran of the bench with silver hair and sharp eyes, studied the room over her reading glasses. Something about this case had caught her attention from the preliminary hearings. Maybe it was the defendant's unusual calmness, or perhaps the slight inconsistencies in the police reports, tiny details that didn't quite add up. "All rise," the bailiff called out, and the proceedings began. The prosecutor's opening statement painted a picture of a successful real estate developer who had secretly built a drug empire. He gestured dramatically at evidence bags containing the drugs allegedly found in the BMW, at financial records supposedly showing suspicious transactions. "The evidence will show," he declared confidently, "that this man used his legitimate business as a front for criminal activities." Officers Parker and Wilson, through diligent police work, uncovered this criminal enterprise during a routine traffic stop. In the gallery, several journalists scribbled notes. The case had attracted media attention. A successful businessman caught dealing drugs made for good headlines. What they didn't notice was the plain-clothed federal agents scattered throughout the courtroom, watching every reaction, noting every detail. The defense attorney rose next. She was young, appointed by the court, and seemingly overwhelmed by the high-profile case. Her opening statement was brief and seemed uncertain, suggesting only that the evidence might not be as clear-cut as it appeared. Officer Parker took the stand first, telling his well-rehearsed story. He described the traffic stop, the suspicious behavior, the discovery of drugs. His testimony was smooth, practiced. He'd done this many times before. "And what made you initially stop the vehicle?" the prosecutor asked. "The car was weaving between lanes," Parker replied confidently. "When we approached, the driver appeared nervous and evasive." In the defendant's watch, the tiny recording device continued its work, just as it had done during the actual stop. The GPS data silently contradicted every word of Parker's testimony, showing the car had maintained a perfectly straight course. The judge's eyes narrowed slightly as she noticed small inconsistencies in the testimony. The timestamps on the evidence logs didn't quite match the officer's story. The sequence of events seemed somehow off. Officer Wilson testified next, his story matching his partner's almost word for word, too perfectly, as if rehearsed. He described finding additional evidence in the car, each piece mysteriously appearing exactly when needed to support their case. Throughout the testimony, the defendant remained unusually calm. He watched the officers with an almost analytical interest, as if studying their performance. His public defender, following his instructions, asked only basic questions during cross-examination. But something was shifting in the courtroom. The judge's expression grew increasingly skeptical as she reviewed the evidence logs. Several jurors started taking more detailed notes, picking up on the slight contradictions in the officers' stories. In the back of the courtroom, the federal agents exchanged subtle glances. They knew what was coming, the carefully gathered evidence that would turn this routine drug case into something much bigger. The prosecution was building what looked like an airtight case, but tiny cracks were beginning to show. The timing of discoveries didn't quite line up. The routes described by the officers contradicted each other slightly. Small details that most people would miss, but that the judge was clearly noting in her careful observations. As the day drew to a close, tension built in the courtroom. The prosecution was nearly ready to rest its case, confident in the evidence and testimony. Officers Parker and Wilson sat back, already anticipating another successful conviction. They had no idea that their carefully constructed case was about to shatter, that their years of corrupt practices were about to be exposed. The real story was about to unfold, and nothing in their years of frame-ups had prepared them for what was coming next. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the courthouse windows as the prosecution prepared to rest its case. The air in the courtroom felt heavy with anticipation. Officers Parker and Wilson sat confidently at their table, exchanging small smiles. They'd presented what seemed like an airtight case: evidence bags, financial records, witness testimonies, all pointing to their target's guilt. Just as the district attorney stood to make his final statement, the courtroom doors opened. A group of suited individuals entered silently, led by a distinguished-looking man with a government ID badge. The judge raised an eyebrow at the interruption, but said nothing as the newcomers took seats in the gallery. "Your Honor," the defendant's young public defender started, her voice suddenly stronger than it had been throughout the trial. Before the prosecution rests, the defense would like to present new evidence that has just come to light. Officer Parker's smile faltered slightly. This wasn't part of the usual script. The distinguished man who had just entered stood up. "Your Honor, I'm a senior director with the Central Intelligence Agency." I need to speak with you in chambers immediately regarding a matter of national security." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The judge's eyes widened slightly, but she maintained her composure. "Court will take a brief recess. Counsel in my chambers now." What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. As the judge and lawyers disappeared into chambers, federal agents moved to block the courtroom exits. Officer Wilson shifted uncomfortably in his seat, while Parker's confident expression crumbled into confusion. 20 minutes later, the judge returned. Her face was stern as she took her seat. The defendant now had new counsel, two sharp-looking federal attorneys who had appeared as if from nowhere. The young public defender sat behind them, a small smile playing at her lips. In light of new information, the judge announced, "This court will now hear additional evidence." One of the federal attorneys stood. "Your Honor, we'd like to play an audio recording from the night of the arrest." The color drained from Officer Parker's face as crystal-clear audio filled the courtroom. His own voice, captured by the defendant's watch, revealed every detail of the frame-up. The GPS data showed with perfect precision how they had moved the car to plant evidence. Timestamps proved the impossibility of their official story. But that was just the beginning. "Your Honor," the federal attorney continued, "the defendant is a deep-cover CIA operative working on matters of national security. These officers not only framed an innocent man, they compromised an ongoing federal investigation. We have evidence of similar actions against at least 20 other citizens over the past 3 years." Photographs appeared on the courtroom screens, traffic stops, arrests, evidence logs. A pattern of corruption laid bare in clinical detail. The journalists in the gallery were scribbling frantically now, realizing they were witnessing something much bigger than a simple drug case. Officer Wilson slumped in his chair as his years of misconduct were exposed one by one. Parker stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched, watching his carefully constructed world crumble around him. The judge's voice cut through the stunned silence. "Officers, stand up." They rose slowly, their badges suddenly feeling heavy on their chests. "You are both immediately remanded into federal custody pending charges of civil rights violations, evidence tampering, false imprisonment, and obstruction of justice. Bailiff, take them into custody." As federal agents moved forward with handcuffs, the full impact of what was happening seemed to hit Parker. His face contorted with rage as he turned to look at the defendant, the man he'd thought was an easy target, who turned out to be so much more. The CIA operative remained calm, meeting Parker's gaze steadily. In that moment, the corrupt officer finally understood just how badly he had miscalculated. He hadn't just picked the wrong target. He'd helped expose years of systematic abuse that would now be dragged into the light. The courtroom erupted into chaos as reporters rushed for the doors, eager to break the story. More federal agents appeared, securing evidence and computers from the prosecutor's table. The judge called for order, her gavel barely audible over the commotion. Through it all, the operative sat quietly, his mission accomplished. He hadn't set out to expose police corruption, but when it had landed in his lap, he'd turned it into an opportunity to protect not just himself, but every other citizen who might have become a target of these corrupt officers. As Parker and Wilson were led away in handcuffs, the operative thought about all the others, the innocent people who'd been framed before him, who hadn't had the benefit of CIA recording equipment and federal resources. Today's revelation would give them all the chance at justice. The aftermath of the courtroom revelation swept through the city like a tidal wave. News helicopters circled above the courthouse as dozens of reporters crowded the steps, their cameras flashing in the late afternoon sun. Inside, federal agents moved efficiently through the police precinct, securing files and computers that would reveal the full scope of the corruption. The police chief stood before a forest of microphones, his face grim as he announced an independent investigation of the entire department. Behind him, more officers were being led out in handcuffs. The investigation had already uncovered 3 more corrupt cops who had worked with Parker and Wilson. "We are deeply troubled by these revelations," the chief admitted, his voice heavy with responsibility. "We're reaching out to every citizen who was arrested by these officers over the past 5 years. Each case will be thoroughly reviewed." In a quiet office across town, the CIA operative sat with his handler, watching the press conference on a small TV. His cover was still intact, The media had been told only that federal investigators had uncovered the corruption, with no mention of his true identity. 23 people, the handler said quietly, reviewing the initial findings. That's how many innocent citizens these officers framed over the past 3 years, and those are just the ones we know about so far. The operative nodded, thinking about how easily he could have become just another statistic, another innocent person behind bars, if he hadn't had his watch recording device. His thoughts turned to all those other victims, the business owners, the professionals, the ordinary citizens who had their lives turned upside down by corrupt officers abusing their power. Back at the courthouse, people were coming forward. A young teacher who lost her job after a false drug charge. A small business owner who had to sell his shop to pay for legal fees. A medical student whose career was nearly derailed by planted evidence. One by one, they told their stories to federal investigators, years of buried injustice finally coming to light. The district attorney's office had set up a special task force to review every case Parker and Wilson had ever touched. Files stretched back years, each one representing someone's life, someone's future that had been impacted by corruption. "We've got something," a federal analyst called out, pointing to her screen. "Look at these patterns." The same judge signed off on most of their search warrants. The same evidence lockup officer was always on duty when they logged new evidence. The investigation was growing, revealing not just individual corrupt officers, but a system that had allowed them to operate. The police department's internal affairs division was being completely restructured. New oversight committees were being formed, including civilian representatives to ensure transparency. In the following weeks, the changes began to take effect. Body camera rules were strengthened, no more convenient malfunctions during traffic stops. Evidence handling procedures were overhauled, requiring multiple officers to verify and document every step. Anonymous tip lines were set up for officers to report misconduct without fear of retaliation. The operative watched it all unfold from a distance, quietly continuing his real estate work as his cover demanded. He attended community meetings where citizens shared their stories of police harassment and false arrests. He saw tears of relief as wrongful convictions were overturned, families reunited, lives restored. Parker and Wilson faced federal prosecutors, their swagger replaced by slumped shoulders and hollow eyes as the evidence mounted against them. Their own records betrayed them, GPS data from patrol cars showing unauthorized stops, dashboard camera footage that contradicted their reports, financial records revealing unexplained deposits. 1 month after the courtroom revelation, the operative sat in his handler's office, reviewing the impact of their unplanned operation. 38 wrongful convictions overturned so far, the handler reported. 6 more officers under investigation. 3 judges suspended pending review of their involvement. The police department's entire leadership structure is being rebuilt from the ground up. The operative thought about the young public defender who had played her part perfectly, pretending to be overwhelmed until the perfect moment. He thought about the judge who had suspected something wasn't right but needed proof to act. He thought about all the good officers who could now do their jobs without corrupt colleagues undermining the public's trust. Sometimes, he said quietly, the best way to protect national security is to ensure justice at home. In the end, Parker and Wilson's attempt to frame an innocent man had accomplished something they never intended. Their actions had exposed a corrupt system, given voice to countless victims, and sparked real change in how police power was monitored and controlled. The operative returned to his deep cover work, his real estate business continuing to provide the perfect facade for his CIA activities. But he carried with him the knowledge that sometimes the most important victories aren't won in the shadows of international espionage, but in the clear light of justice in our own backyard. Sometimes, he said quietly, the best way to protect national security is to ensure justice at home. In the end, Parker and Wilson's attempt to frame an innocent man had accomplished something they never intended. Their actions had exposed a corrupt system, given voice to countless victims, and sparked real change in how police power was monitored and controlled. The operative returned to his deep cover work, his real estate business continuing to provide the perfect facade for his CIA activities. But he carried with him the knowledge that sometimes the most important victories aren't won in the shadows of international espionage, but in the clear light of justice in our own sometimes, he said quietly, the the best way to protect national security is to ensure justice at home. In the end, Parker and Wilson's attempt to frame an innocent man had accomplished something they never intended. Their actions had exposed a corrupt system, given voice to countless victims, and sparked real change in how police power was monitored and controlled. The operative returned to his deep cover work, his real estate business continuing to provide the perfect facade for his CIA activities. But he carried with him the knowledge that sometimes the most important victories aren't won in the shadows of international espionage, but in the clear light of justice in our own backyard. One backyard.